was set up because Celia and Cecil Manson really they loved this part of the world. They loved Katherine Mansfield, and they probably began by persuading the Monton authorities that Katherine Mansfield had spent time here and should be commemorated. Sheila Wynne was their friend, and she was the heir of the Hannah Shoes, I think. Anyway, she had some significant source of income, and they persuaded her to back it. She was a theatre person in Wellington.
How does a Frenchman living in Nice come to be involved with the Wynne Manson Monton Trust based in New Zealand?
Well, when I lived in New Zealand, and that was I left about 25 years ago, I heard about this scheme mainly through the death of Anton Vogt, and one day I read in the paper, in the Listen at the time, that Anton Vogt, who lived in Menton, had died, and I heard about this scheme, and when a few years later I left New Zealand to settle in Nice near Menton, I immediately got in touch with the fellows, and that's how I got in touch with this fellowship.
So to step you back a couple of steps, was Anton Vogt the person who was unofficially looking after the Mansfield fellows?
He was doing it more or less officially, and with his wife Birgit, and he was a famous educationalist, very well known in New Zealand. He retired in Monaco, and for many years he welcomed the fellows, and I followed his footsteps, and I replaced him in a way. And then his wife went to New Zealand and fell in love with the first writer I met, Raleigh Habib, and I think that they live happily in New Zealand together.
So how many years ago was that you met Raleigh Habib?
I met Raleigh Habib, and that's the first writer I met in 1984. So I must have met more than 30 New Zealand writers, and I think that I know personally 1/3 of all the New Zealand writers, because it's a small country, so I'm very proud of knowing personally these writers.
Well, each day I would get up, look at my email from New Zealand over breakfast on the terrace on the iPad, and then take the walk to the writing room. It's a nice 35-minute walk across town. I would put the iPod on and listen to a literary podcast of some description on the way over there quite often, and very often I would find I arrived at the room with the first line of a poem in my head, a poem waiting to be written. So it was a very productive time. I thought of it as part of my work time, really, the walk to the room.
Things have changed over the years. As I said, I've been in charge for 25 years now. And at first, it was very low key. But thanks to somebody from the Menton City Council, Monsieur Lanlot, things improved over the years. There is now a key ceremony a few days after the writer's arrival. And now it's very well accepted. The local paper comes to this ceremony. They take pictures, the writers are invited to some functions. So now it's quite important and quite well known in the region, especially in Menton. And the mayor of Menton, Monsieur Jean-Claude Guibal, supports the scheme. He's always very happy to meet the writers. So there's a very strong link between the Menton City Council, the city of Menton, and New Zealand.
Well, when you arrive in Menton, you are ceremoniously given the key to the writing room in an event that happens in the mairie, in the salle de mariage, which is where the big Jean Cocteau paintings are all around you. So you do feel like you're being welcomed into the cultural life of the Côte d'Azur in a very direct fashion because of the location of that ceremony. And the other crucial element for the Mansfield Fellows, I think, is that William Rubinstein is there to meet you at the airport. William has been involved for a very long time now with the Mansfield Fellows, and it's fantastic, particularly for those of us whose French is minimal, to know that somebody is there to help you out if you have a problem that is beyond your linguistic capacities, whether it be dealing with a plumber or an electrician or dealing with French bureaucracy. If things get too hard, there is someone you can call on. And William has been fantastic in that role. He's a very open, generous, hospitable man.
I thought, as a kind of acknowledgement of the fact that it was a Mansfield memorial, that I should pay proper attention to Mansfield, which I'd never done before. I'd read bits here and there. But one of the things I did while I was here was I read everything published by her. And it was here that I conceived of the notion of a selection of letters and journals, which no one had done before, was to put the two together. And so in the 5 months remaining of that academic sabbatical leave, after 8 months here, we had 5 months in London, and I put the proposal to Penguin, and they eventually, when I'd completed it, they published it as a hardcover, but also as a Penguin Modern Classics. And it remained at least 25 years in Penguin Modern Classics, the letters and journals.
When you arrive at the room, there is a piece of paper on the table with a list of, in my case, the preceding 41 writers who had sat in that room. And it's a pretty impressive list. Alan Curnow is there, Janet Frame, C.K. Stead, Owen Marshall, Fiona Kidman, Damien Wilkins, Bill Manhire. So you feel like you're in very good company. And of course, Katherine Mansfield herself is there in portrait form on the wall looking over your shoulder. And although the writing room is not a room that Mansfield herself would have inhabited in the villa, I did have one set of visitors who suggested to me that rabbits may have been kept there. So for me, forever after, it was the rabbit hutch. But she's very much there in the sense that there is a trail of visitors who come to pay homage to her at the memorial. So you're having conversations every now and again with people about her writing or her life, you're comparing what you know and what they know. But for me also, she was there with her words, because on the bookshelf in the writing room there is a very much thumbed, in fact fallen apart copy of C.K. Stead's edition of the letters and journals, a joint edition that mixes the two up. And one of the first things I did when I got there was read through those letters and journals and just loved the tone of them. And maybe it was that got me into keeping a writing journal while I was there, which is not something I normally do, but which became a great pleasure for me. And perhaps some of Mansfield's tone has crept into those journals of mine from time to time.
It's a great pleasure for me to be first of all to know about the new writer before he or she comes, and then I'm at the airport with a sign welcoming him or her, and then I have the pleasure of meeting at my place all these famous people, and they are all delightful. Of course, they are all different, and what I gain that I keep a link with my second country, because of course I am French, but I took New Zealand citizenship, and it's a good way for me to keep a link with New Zealand. Sometimes I read their works, and I read some of their books or poems, and it's a real pleasure for me to be a local trustee and have the pleasure, the honor of meeting you famous New Zealand writers.
And so do you foresee doing this for many years to come?
I would love to do it until I die, so please keep it. We should try and keep collecting the money, and I hope that this link, which is so important for New Zealand, perhaps even more important in New Zealand than in France, I hope it will last forever to honor the memory of Katherine Mansfield, but also it's more as important as honoring her memory is the fact that it's very, very good for writers. They are, as I said before, they are very happy to be in Menton, and they write about Menton. Some of them wrote poems or were inspired by their lives in Menton. So please keep it for the good of New Zealand literature.
The thing about living in Menton as opposed to living in a more familiar culture and language such as England is that even though it's still a Western culture, and yes, they don't do things so differently there, nonetheless everything is just a little bit different from what you're accustomed to, and there's a terrific element of waking up the mind that comes with that, which is really useful for a writer. Your attention is heightened, I think, to even the everyday things, and I found that incredibly stimulating. Of course, on a practical level, it's a beautiful climate. The beach is there at the end of the writing day, so you can go for a swim if you feel the need at the end of the day. Food at the market is fabulous. We certainly ate a lot of very nice goat's cheese while we were there, and generally it's a small town, so it's not too demanding. It's easy to get around, and just being dropped down or dropped out of your life and all the day-to-day concerns that you have, particularly if you're a writer who has to make a living by other means, as poets generally have to do. The luxury of just being able to write and to have the writing going on in background mode, even when you're not at your desk, was just fantastic.
And to see New Zealand from the perspective of far away is enormously helpful and important and often crucial, because, you know, we have tended to be provincial and somewhat enclosed. I think as the decades have gone by, there have been more and more and more opportunities for New Zealand writers to get away and experience the world at large.
The internet gives us the illusion, I think, that we are much more connected with the world, and in some ways intellectually that's true, but if you don't have the luxury to get out, if you don't have the time or the money, as writers so often don't, to be out in the world, it's very easy to get a little bit self-enclosed and introverted down in our beautiful corner of the Pacific, I think. So there's a huge advantage just in seeing the world from a different point of view. Of course, the time to write is an immense luxury. And yes, it's also true that you could do that in Auckland or Tauranga or Bluff. But the thing about being dropped down in another culture is that it slightly reshapes your mental world, and that's got to come out in the writing somehow. I don't think the point of going to Menton is to write about France, although some writers have. It's more to give you the experience of being in a different culture, not as a tourist, not as someone passing through, but as someone who has the leisure to sit back and observe, to go out and explore. There's something about being slightly discombobulated that I think is quite useful to a writer.
I think the value of the fellowship has been huge, because so many of our best writers and second best writers have have profited by it, have expanded their horizons, and one assumes that their writing has been better for that. I think we've gained a lot from it. There was a 40-year commemoration last year, was it?
Year before last.
The year before last.
Number 42. So.
Yeah. And one really had the feeling then that of how much benefit there had been to New Zealand. Huge benefit, I think.
I was working on a creative non-fiction project about the life and death of the 19th century English anatomist, poet and suicide Thomas Lovell Beddoes. So one of the great advantages for me in being on that side of the world was that I was able to go and do research in the places that he lived. He lived in England for the first half of his life and in Germany and Switzerland for the second. So it was a great base from which to go and visit the places that he lived in and to get a sense of those cities now, because the book is as much interested in how we think about the issues that come up in the course of his life now, but also following his traces in the world now, as it is in telling stories from the past. So location-wise, it was fantastic as well. A project that was a great pleasure to do, and it was also a great pleasure to do because it was completed and published and launched in the time that I was there, was a collaboration with the New Zealand composer Jonathan Besser and the New Zealand artist now resident in New York, Max Gimblett. Jonathan had composed some music using gamelan, and he sent both Max and I his pencil sketches, his music manuscripts for those gamelan pieces, and asked both of us to respond independently to them. So Jonathan was in New Zealand, I was in France, and Max was in New York. And I initially made some little sketches, rather like Jonathan's musical manuscript sketches, as a kind of warm-up to the project. But the thing that really got the big poem going, which has become the title poem of the book, The Green Bicycle, was something that I saw every day on my walk to the writing room, and it was indeed a green bicycle. It was a topiary bicycle, which was sitting outside one of the cafes on the Porte de Garavant. And having seen it every day, one morning I walked past it with the deadline for producing the poem rather near and no great ideas underway. And the first line just came to me: morning delivers a leafy green bicycle. You jump aboard and ride into the jungle. And that bicycle became my vehicle for an imaginative journey at that point. I sat down at the desk that morning, and 4 hours later the poem was done. And it was a great pleasure to write, but it was also a great pleasure to have it sit alongside Max's brilliant original artworks, I think Indonesian art, and Jonathan's music, because there's a CD of the music, and there's also a CD in the back of the book with some of the poems on it and the music as well. So it was a whole package. I was very disappointed not to be able to be at the launch in September of that year, but the fact that I was away did enable me to do was to meet Max on my way home to New Zealand. I visited New York for 10 days and visited him in the studio, which was a great experience.
And are there any particularly memorable moments that you can think of from the history of all these writers that you've met and their experiences here?
Some of them, of course, I remember very well because they were very famous in New Zealand, like Maurice G. or Witi Himeira was very, very impressive. Of course, I didn't know much of him before I met him, but he was wonderful because after a few minutes at my place, as I invite all of them, and I invited you when you arrived in Menton, he took off his shoes, and after 5 minutes, I thought that I had known this man for many, many years. And we became close friends, and he wrote a lot when he was in Menton, and he wrote Buli Basha, and he told me that he took me to as one of the Maori chiefs in Buli Basha, so I'm very proud of it.
There's so much to see in the relatively immediate vicinity of Menton, particularly in terms of little art museums that are dotted all up and down the coast. There's a Bonnard Museum, there are Matisse and Chagall museums, there's the Musée Picasso in Antibes, and endless others really. There's also throughout the summer a lot of festivals up and down the coast. I was particularly interested in the jazz festivals in Nice and Juan-les-Pins, but virtually every small village has some kind of music festival or cultural festival. And Menton itself, of course, has a terrific classical music festival, which, despite the smallness of the town, draws some pretty big names, and has it takes place in a beautiful outdoor location outside the basilica. So you're sitting outdoors at night under a beautiful moon, watching this, listening to this exquisite music.
But for me, the reason I keep coming back to it is that it's a very comfortable environment. It's physically lovely. You can swim, you can see beautiful things, you can travel to other parts round about. But you're immersed in French culture and French language, and that's a sort of double lift out of the New Zealand experience. It's not that you want people to abandon New Zealand, but you want them to get out of it and see it from a distance.
We travelled mostly at the beginning and the end of our stay there, but while we were in Menton, we did go to Paris with the help of the French embassy. And Paris, I have to say, entirely lived up to its expectations, or rather to our expectations. And spent a lot of time, because my project seemed to involve a lot of cemeteries and anatomy museums, I spent a lot of time poking around in Père Lachaise and looked for some of the writers I had been interested in the past, as well as some of the contemporaries of Thomas Lovell Beddoes, the writer I was currently working on. Gérard de Nerval is there, for example. Proust is there. Of course, Oscar Wilde is there, and we managed to see Oscar's tomb before all the lipstick kisses were cleaned away. So I was very pleased about that.
But I mean, I think it continues to be important, and I think the French culture is in itself so rich.
I think the Mansfield trustees are some of the unsung heroes of New Zealand literature. Actually, they put a lot of effort in for no direct reward for themselves, and it's not always easy. Sponsors come and go. And it's a tribute to them that they have managed to keep this fellowship going for so long. There are not many arts fellowships in New Zealand that have had such a long life, or indeed arts festivals or any kind of arts sponsorship. It's a great rarity to have this sense of duration and continuity and great achievement behind a fellowship. So 3 cheers for the trustees, I say. They do a fantastic job.